Hello and welcome to the Golden Trope Story Hour, where ChatGPT generates the story and fake Marlon Brando generates the excitement. I thought that today we would try something a little bit different. Let's reach out to Chat. Dear Chat, I hope this communique finds you well. There was a radio program in the 1940s called Pat Novak for Hire. I believe those shows and their scripts are in the public domain. Are you able to retrieve any of them and write them out for me, like a secretary or a stenographer would? Enter. Yes. The scripts and audio recordings for Pat Novak for Hire, a classic radio series starring Jack Webb, are available in the public domain, writes Chat. I cannot provide a full script directly. After all, I'm not a secretary, nor a stenographer. But I can craft a short story inspired by the style and themes of Pat Novak for Hire. Okay, Chat. Can you write me a 6,000-word detective tale inspired by the Rory Malone episode of Pat Novak for Hire? Oh, enter. Yes, I can, writes Chat. I can create a detailed, original short story inspired by its plot, using elements like the characters and events described in summaries or snippets. I'll reimagine the episode in a noir-inspired format. I'll maintain the gritty noir tone and reimagine key events while adding depth and atmosphere. If that works for you, let me know and I'll get started. Well, yes, Chat, please. And thank you. Okay, here we go. Rory Malone, a Pat Novak tale. Chapter 1, $100 Headache. The night started like most nights, cold, foggy, and duller than a dime store razor. It was one of those nights when the fog rolls in thick enough to choke a fish. The kind of night where a guy like me, Pat Novak, gets reminded that San Francisco isn't a city. It's a cheap suit with deep pockets, full of trouble. I was in my office at Pier 19, debating whether or not I had enough bourbon to make it through the night, when she walked in. She was trouble in high heels, all right. She had the kind of face that could inspire a guy to write bad poetry, and the kind of figure that would make him forget how to rhyme. Her dress clung to her like it was fighting for its life, and when she looked at me, I felt like I owed her the world. Mr. Novak, she asked. Her voice was smooth enough to grease an engine. That's what it says on the door. What can I do for you? I need you to keep an eye on someone. A boxer. Her eyes scanned the room like she expected something to jump out of the shadows. His name's Rory Malone. I didn't recognize the name, but I knew the type. Guys like Malone, boxers and grifters, and sometimes both. They're always trouble. They have fists like anvils and brains like soggy toast. He's got a bout tonight at the Civic Arena, she said, but he's gotten himself into some trouble. What kind of trouble? I asked, leaning back in my chair. The kind that walks in with a gun and leaves with your wallet. Well, that got my attention. So what do you want me to do about it? Watch him. Make sure he makes it through the night. She slid a $100 bill across my desk. Lady, I said, for this kind of cash, I'll make sure he wakes up with a smile. I'm not sure what I meant by that, but I pocketed the bill. Who's Malone fighting tonight? She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with her purse. I want you to watch him, but not just in the ring. Rory has debts, and there are people who want to collect. That was all she said. She gave me a look that could have melted ice, and she walked out, leaving me with her perfume and a bad feeling. Rory Malone. I didn't like the sound of it, But for $100, I didn't have to. Chapter 2. The Boxer, the Bookie, and the Corpse in the Alley. I found Rory Malone down at the Fleet Street Gym. It was the kind of place where dreams come to sweat and die. The air smelled like old leather and bad decisions, and the lighting was dim enough to hide 'em both. Rory Malone was pounding away at the heavy bag, his fists landing with the kind of force that made you want to double-check your insurance policy. He was a big guy, and he had a boxer's face, a little too lumpy, a little too scarred. When I walked in, he glanced up, his eyes as hard as a left hook. "Rory Malone," I said, lighting a cigarette. He didn't stop punching. "Your lady hired me," I said. He stopped mid-swing and turned to face me. "Kitty?" His voice said it softly, and for a second I saw something behind all the bravado. Fear, maybe. At least, something close to fear. "She says you've got trouble," I says. "Says you've got a debt collector breathing down your neck." Malone laughed, but it was the kind of laugh you hear at funerals. "That's my business," he says. "She's worried about you," I says. "Yeah, well, Kitty worries too much," he says. "Tell her I'll be fine." "She paid me to make sure you don't end up in a ditch," I says. "So why don't you save us both some time and tell me what's going on?" Malone hesitated. Then he sighed. "Fine," he says. "Sleagle's a bookie. I owe him more than I've got, and now he's saying I have to throw my fight tonight, or else." Before I could press him, a man walked in, a wiry guy, with a thin mustache, a scar running from his temple to his jawline, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Malone," he says. His voice was like a knife. "Time to talk." The way Malone's fists clenched, I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. The wiry guy smiled again, as warm as a tax audit. I leaned against the wall and lit another cigarette. "Who's your friend, Rory?" I asked, exhaling smoke like I was trying to blend in with the outside fog. "Nobody you need to know, Novak," the wiry guy said. His voice was smoother than a card shark's shuffle, but not quite as trustworthy. "Why don't you take a walk?" he says. "Malone and I have business." Malone didn't look happy about it, but he didn't argue either. "Relax, pal," I says. "I'm just here to make sure Malone doesn't end up in a ditch or a headline. Unless you're planning something different." That earned me a glare, and it earned Malone a warning. "Fight's at 8, the wiry guy says. Don't be late, and don't be stupid." The wiry guy with the scar straightened and adjusted his hat. Then he left without looking back, but his shadow lingered like a hangover. I waited for the door to close before turning to Malone. "Was that Sleagle?" "That's Sleagle," Malone muttered. "He runs the book on tonight's fight, and if I don't lose, he's going to make sure I don't never walk either." I left Malone there, unwrapping his fists, looking like if he did it just right, he might be able to rewind a lot of wasted years. On my way out of the gym, I decided to follow Sleagle. He had the kind of look that spelled trouble, and in my line of work, trouble is bread and butter. The guy was fast, slipping through the alleys like a rat in a maze. I kept my distance, staying in the shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew I was there. Eventually, he disappeared into a rundown warehouse on the edge of the docks. I debated whether or not to follow him inside, but decided against it. Instead, I tried looking in from a window. That's when I found the body. It was a man, or what was left of him, slumped against the alley wall, his face frozen in surprise, and a knife sticking out of his chest. The blood hadn't dried yet. I crouched down, checking his pockets. No wallet, no ID. Just a scrap of paper with 2 words scribbled on it. "Malone, tonight." That's when I heard the voice. "Well, well, Novak," said Inspector Hellman. "You've got a lot of nerve standing over a dead body." I turned to see him, flanked by 2 uniformed cops. The cops looked like they were waiting for an excuse to rough me up. "Hello, Hellman," I said, straightening up. "Looks like your job just got a little harder." "Don't get cute," Hellman snapped. "Who is he and why'd you kill him?" "Never met him," I said. "I'm not in the habit of leaving my work half finished." Hellman didn't laugh. Instead, he motioned to the uniforms. "Take him in," he said. "Now wait a minute, Hellman," I protested. "I didn't do this. I just found the guy." "Sure you did," Hellman said, smirking, "and I just found my badge in a cereal box." "Well, for once you're saying something that makes sense," I shot back. That's all the excuse the uniforms needed. They took a couple turns each teaching me the intricacies of human pinball. Then Hellman dragged me down to the precinct, where he spent the next 2 hours trying to pin the murder on me. He had about as much luck as a guy trying to sell a beach house in the Sahara, but that didn't stop him from trying. "You've got motive, Novak," Hellman said, pacing the room. "You're mixed up with Malone and his dirty debts. Maybe this guy was one of Schlegel's boys and things got out of hand. Or maybe," I shot back, "he was sent to take out Malone and whoever did it wanted to make me the patsy." Hellman scowled. "You've got a big mouth, Novak. One day I'm going to shut it for good." "Until then," I said, standing up, "I've got a murder to solve." Hellman didn't stop me as I walked out. Maybe he knew I was innocent. Maybe he just wanted me to lead him to the real killer. Either way, I had work to do. Chapter 3, The Plan. I had to come up with some kind of plan, even if it wasn't much, and it wasn't. My plan started with Jocko Madigan, a former doctor turned professional drinker. I found him at the Seahorse Tavern trying to explain to a bartender why bourbon should count as a vitamin. "Jocko," I said, pulling up a stool, "I need your help." "Patsy," he said, raising his glass, "if I had a nickel for every time I heard that, I could probably buy this bar and drink it dry. Why don't you go out and come back again with a piggy bank so we can test my theory?" "Knock it off, Jocko. This isn't a social call," I said. "I need you to distract a bookie named Schlegel while I even the odds for a fighter named Malone." "Why, Patsy," Jocko said, "I'd be delighted. But only because it sounds like it'll end in disaster, and I do love a good train wreck." Chapter 4, The Setup. The Civic Arena was packed to the rafters with drunks, gamblers, and a few folks who might have actually cared about boxing. The crowd was loud and ugly, the kind of people who pray for a knockout and cheer for a murder. Malone was in his corner, muttering to himself like a guy about to walk the plank. In the opposite corner was Eddie the Hammer Hayes, a mountain with a wrecking ball for a right hand. Hayes wasn't the kind of guy you beat. He was the kind of guy you survived, if you were lucky. I spotted Kitty in the stands, her face as pale as a ghost. I squeezed through the crowd and slid into the seat next to her. "Novak," she said, her voice trembling like a sad violin solo. "Did you talk to Rory?" I could smell cheap gin on her breath. "Yeah, I talked to him," I said. "I'd start shopping for flowers." She grabbed my arm, her nails digging in like a dog on a wishbone. "You've got to help him. Rory's a good man. He just made some bad choices." "Lady," I said, "if bad choices were gold, this city would be Fort Knox. But don't worry, Malone's tougher than he looks." "He has to be," she said. Just then the ring announcer started his spiel. We settled into our seats as carefree as two kittens in a wolf's den. The fight started slow, with both men trading jabs like they were just testing the waters. Malone's punches were sharp, but Eddie Hayes moved with the confidence of a Sherman tank, slow, deliberate, and very sure of what he'd destroy. By the third round, Malone was sweating bullets and Hayes was grinning like he'd already won. Then came round 4. From my spot in the crowd, I kept one eye on the ring and the other on Schlegel, who was watching like a vulture that had already picked its next meal. Jocko was doing his part, which mostly involved spilling drinks on Schlegel and apologizing profusely in a way that somehow made things worse. "Novak," Kitty hissed beside me, clutching my arm so tight it could have been a submission hold. "What's happening? Why isn't Rory going down?" "Relax," I said. "He's doing fine." But I knew it wasn't true. Just then, Eddie landed a haymaker and Malone hit the mat like he was auditioning for a chalk outline. The ref started the count, but Malone didn't move. The crowd roared, Schlegel grinned, and Kitty buried her face in her hands. "Stay down, Malone," I muttered under my breath. "Just stay down." But Rory Malone wasn't the staying down type. He staggered to his feet at the count of 9, and the bell rang before Hayes could finish him off. Chapter 5, The Double Cross. After the fight, things went south faster than a snowbird in January. Malone won the fight by decision. Sleagle was waiting backstage, his face darker than a back alley on a stormy night. He was flanked by two guys who looked like they could play catch with a Buick. "Nice fight, Malone," Sleagle said, his voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that made you want to check your back for knives. "Too bad it's your last." "Relax, Sleagle," I said, stepping between them. "The fight's over. Let the guy enjoy his victory lap." "Out of the way, Novak," Sleagle snapped. "Malone owes me, and I collect in full." That's when Eddie walked in, still rubbing his jaw. He looked as angry as a bear hibernating in a cave with a drippy faucet. "You set me up, Sleagle," Eddie growled. "You said Malone was a pushover, but he damn near took my head off." "Relax, Eddie," Sleagle said, trying to smooth things over. "You still got paid." "Not enough." "You said I'd win easy," Eddie growled, pointing a ham-sized finger at Sleagle. For the first time all night, Sleagle looked scared, his confidence cracking like cheap plaster. His two gorillas stepped forward. That was the opening I needed. While Eddie and Sleagle argued, I slipped Malone and Kitty out the back door. "You're clear for now," I told them, "but if you want to stay that way, you'd better leave town." "What about you?" Kitty asked. "Don't worry about me," I said. "I've got a knack for staying alive. Mostly by accident." Chapter 6, Loose Ends. By the time the dust settled, Malone was out the door with Kitty, while Eddie, Sleagle, and the two gorillas were redecorating the locker room in a style reminiscent of early war zone. Jocko found me leaning against a lamppost outside the arena, lighting what was left of my last cigarette. "Well, Patsy," he said, swaying slightly, "another night, another brush with mortality. I'd toast to our survival, but I'm not yet sure we have survived." "Don't worry," I said, exhaling smoke. "There's always tomorrow." Jocko grinned, clapping me on the shoulder. "And that, my dear Patsy, is exactly why I drink." "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. He wandered off into the fog. I turned and walked back to Pier 19. Another job done, another dollar earned, and another night where I lived just long enough to regret it. The next morning I found Sleagle waiting outside my office, flanked by his two gorillas. "You cost me a lot of money, Novak," Sleagle said. "Yeah? Consider it a lesson in bad investments," I told him. The gorillas didn't like that. One of them grabbed me by the collar and lifted me off the ground like I was a paper lantern. "Easy, pal," I said. "We're going to do you like we did Eddie," said the gorilla. "And like we're going to do Malone when we find him," said Sleagle. "Where is he?" That's when Jocko showed up, swinging a bottle of bourbon like it was Excalibur. He was a few minutes late, but at least he remembered to bring Inspector Hellman and a few uniforms with him. The gorilla dropped me, and I took the opportunity to introduce Sleagle to my right hook. Hellman and his men looked the other way for once, then cuffed Sleagle and his boys. By the time the dust settled, Jocko was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Well, Patsy," he said, "another fine mess you've gotten us into." "You got lucky this time, Novak," Hellman said gruffly. "Story of my life," I said. Hellman turned and walked down the pier to his unmarked car, Jocko pestering him for a ride home the whole way. I walked into my office and poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon from Excalibur. I lit a cigarette and enjoyed the quiet of the early morning, knowing it wouldn't last. Trouble has a knack for finding me. Fee.